Here are my favourite books of all time. Hi guys, my name is Sharon and here we read books of all different genres. If you've seen any of my other previous videos, not that I have that many, but you'll know that I normally wear glasses and today the glasses are off. I know people like good eye contact in their videos, but honestly my eye contact is really poor. I'm visually impaired and I have one eye which just always does its own thing, so I'm sorry for the poor eye contact. I was going through all my favourite lists and honestly I have so many. I don't think I have time to talk about them all, so I had to pick the favourites of the favourites. Some of these I read such a long time ago and some I do look back and I'm like, I'm not sure if I love that as much as I did before, but all these ones I'm going to talk about still hold a special place in my heart. There are quite a few book talk ones, so you might have heard a lot about them before. I won't talk about them in too much detail. I'm kind of going to split this up into genres. Timestamps below in the description. First category is historical fiction. Daisy Jones and the Six by Jenkins Reid. Everyone and their dog has probably read this by now, so I won't talk about it too much. If you've been living under a rock, this is a book about a band in the 70s called Daisy Jones and the Six. They were inspired by Fleetwood Mac, and this book is told in interview format where all the band members are interviewed. Jenkins Reid is one of my favourite authors of all time. Honestly, I like all of their books, but I limited myself to maximum of 3 Jenkins Reid books in this video. This was actually the first book I ever consumed via audio, and I remember the first time round I just found it so confusing because this audiobook has a full cast of narrators, and it was a bit too much for me being my first audiobook. But then after being a seasoned audiobook listener, I did go back and re-listen to it and I loved it even more the second time around. And long story short, this is just a masterpiece. And then another historical favourite from Jenkins Reid is Malibu Rising. I feel like this doesn't get talked about as much, but of course it's still really popular. It's set in the 80s and you follow 4 famous siblings over the course of 24 hours as they host their annual infamous summer party. There's a scene towards the end of the book between the siblings and their dad, and I just remember it made me cry. The scene was really profound and it just stuck with me. I would really love to reread this book because it's been a while. Actually, I'd like to reread all the books on this list. And then another Jenkins Reid favourite is Atmosphere, which is her release from last year. Again, you've probably heard a lot about this. You follow Joan, who's one of the first women in the 80s to be an astronaut, and she's a part of NASA's space program. This is a sapphic love story, and not only does Joan have to navigate misogyny, she also has to keep her romance a secret. There's a dangerous, high-stakes space mission. There are challenging relationship dynamics and family issues. And like everyone else, I had a good cry at the end. Jenkins Reid is just so good at writing relationships between the characters. All her stories feel so unique and different. The next book, The Four Winds by Kristin Hannah. Kristin Hannah is another one of my favourite authors. I've read so many of them already, and again, I love them. The Nightingale, The Great Alone, Wild. But one of my favourites is actually this one. It's set in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl in America. And as a Brit, I had no idea what this was. This was a period of severe drought, which destroyed the environment and agriculture in the Great Plains. This story follows a mother called Elsa who has 2 children, and she decides to take her and her family to California for a better life because where she's living, no rain, no crops. They're dealing with poverty. Also, her husband slash father of her children, if you can really even call him that, is absolutely useless. So Elsa has to make the tough decision to journey to the west. At least I think it's the west because my American geography isn't that great. And of course, this isn't an easy journey. This is a story about survival, resilience, and the love of a mother. Elsa is such a formidable character. She's strong and determined, and there's nothing she won't do to help save her children. My heart broke for her because she had so many struggles to deal with. Also, I've seen so many people who hate this book, and I really don't know why. I really loved this story. It was emotional and heartbreaking, and also infuriating as well. No spoilers, but I had a good cry. And maybe I'm a masochist, but I do like an emotional book that makes me cry. Then we have The Attic Child by Lola Jaye. This is a new favourite actually, I only recently just finished this. This is a historical fiction with a mystery element and dual timelines. You essentially follow two children who are trapped in the same attic but almost a century apart. That synopsis is what drew me to read this, but it was actually so much more than that. In the past timeline, you follow a young black boy called Dikembe in the early 1900s. He is taken from his homeland of what was known back then as the Congo. Now I believe it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and he becomes a companion for this wealthy white man called Sir Richard Babington, and he's a British explorer. So Dikembe is only 12 years old, but he has to leave his life behind and move to England with Richard. Dikembe is distraught. He doesn't speak English, he misses his mother, and he is just constantly wishing for the day when he can go back home. He's in the foreign land of England, and this is a place where he will never be considered an equal. And after a series of unfortunate events, he finds himself trapped in the attic. And in the present day timeline, you follow a woman called Laura, who was also trapped in the same attic as a child. It was such a moving story, and what a journey that both characters go on, but especially Dikembe. I had no idea how these two timelines were going to converge, but Lola Jaye weaved these two stories together so well, and also what an ending. Another historical fiction that I really loved is Lady Tan's Circle of Women by Lisa C. This story is set in China in the 1400s. This is actually inspired by the true story of a Chinese woman in the 15th century who fought against all odds to become a physician. You follow the protagonist throughout her entire life, starting from childhood, and then when she starts training under her grandmother in medicine. But when she gets married, her mother-in-law forbids her to practice. Our protagonist has to deal with different struggles like the patriarchy, societal expectations, challenging friendships and relationships under her husband's roof. I think this is ultimately a story of female empowerment. I loved our main character and her fierce determination for independence and autonomy and trying to do what she thinks is right. There's some really interesting relationship and friendship dynamics in this story. I also love stories that follows someone's entire life journey, and I'm also really interested in TCM, also known as traditional Chinese medicine. So these parts of the book were just so interesting to me, but at the same time it wasn't too hard to understand or wrap your head around. Such a good book. And a book which I've mentioned a few times on my channel already. I might sound like a broken record, but A Song to Drown Rivers by Liang. This is a story inspired by the legend of Circe. She is known as one of the four great beauties of ancient China, and I think perhaps she's meant to be the most beautiful of them all. She was alive a very long time ago, I think something like a few hundred BC. And back then, China wasn't even one big country like we know today. It was made up of lots of smaller kingdoms. Circe is a young girl, and she is recruited by a military advisor called Fan Li, and he recruits her to be a spy for an enemy kingdom. She has to seduce the king and make him fall in love with her. So this is high stakes, but also a tragic love story. There was so much yearning in this. It was beautifully written, and the ending emotionally destroyed me. And this is actually a relatively short book for a historical, so I think the storytelling is really concise. In fact, my only complaint is that I wish the story was longer so I could have stayed in this world longer. Also, I'm so pleased I managed to get a copy of this Fairy Loot edition on Vinted at such a good price. And this is what it looks like under the dust jacket. You have the foiling of Circe, and then on the spine, I wish it did say A Song to Drown Rivers, but instead it has the Chinese characters for Circe, and then it has a really pretty sprayed edge, again the Chinese characters for Circe. This is classed as a fantasy as well, but honestly the fantasy is so minimal and there's only a tiny element at the end. So actually I like to think of this as really just a historical fiction. So now I think that's a good leeway into fantasy. The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This might be very basic of me, but it is one of my favourite books of all time. I don't think I need to go into the plot because I feel like everyone has probably read this by now. This is such a beloved book talk favourite, and it's the love story between Patroclus and Achilles. The friendship between these two characters was so sweet, and then it develops into a romance. And the way that Madeline Miller writes the feelings between these two characters and the way they feel about each other is just so deeply romantic. bawled my eyes out at the end. After I read this, I would then go on to read quite a few more Greek mythology retellings, trying to chase the feeling that this book gave me. And I have read some good ones, but none have really quite made me feel the way that this book made me feel. And then after reading that, I jumped straight into Circe, also by Madeline Miller. This follows the daughter of the god Helios, Circe, who gets banished to an island. I will say I didn't quite love this one as much as the Song of Achilles, but this was still a 5-star. Madeline Miller is the queen of Greek mythology retellings, and they just know how to transport you into another world. Then on to the next section of books, which I guess are kind of just general fiction, lit fic, contemporary fiction. Another Kristin book, which is Another Life. In this story you follow two characters, a teenager called Lauren and an older woman called Angie. Angie has been having a really hard time dealing with infertility issues, and under the weight of this, her and her husband decide to separate. So she moves back to her hometown and she starts helping out at her family's struggling restaurant. You then have the teenager Lauren, who's going through a hard time herself, but in a different way. She is living with her single mother who really doesn't care about Lauren. She is selfish, she can't pay the rent, and she is pretty much just acting like she doesn't have the responsibility of a child. And then one day, Lauren and Angie's lives cross paths. Again, a really emotional and heartbreaking story, which was also heartwarming at the same time. I had tears in my eyes because some scenes were just so sweet and sad. Lauren does do really infuriating things and makes poor decisions, but I guess at the end of the day, she's just a broken teenager. I think Kristin knows how to write a nuanced character really well. Her characters are always really flawed, but they seem real. I was rooting for Lauren and Angie and everything they wanted in life. This is a really beautiful story. The next book, Shark Heart by Emily Habeck. I guess this is a literary contemporary fiction with magical realism. You follow a newlywed couple where the husband has this irreversible genetic condition that is slowly turning him into a great white shark. Yes, this is a really strange premise and I didn't expect to like it as much as I did, but this is a really beautiful love story. This is about marriage, loss and letting go. And even though the husband is obviously turning into a great white shark, which is really weird, I did find this really sad. This couple will eventually have to part ways and learn to live without each other. And there were some really sad moments, but there were also some really heartwarming scenes as well. And this has actually lived rent-free in my head for a really long time now. Next book, Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Tawaguchi. This is translated Japanese fiction, also with magical realism. I actually really love magical realism in my books, and I love the concept of this. Here you have a cafe in Tokyo where the customers can actually travel back in time to speak to a loved one. You have to follow a strict set of rules. This includes sitting in a specific seat in the cafe, you can't change the present or future, and you'll have to finish your coffee before it gets cold. And if you don't follow all these rules, you'll turn into a ghost. You follow different customers who journey to the past to speak to a loved one. For example, there's a wife who goes back in time to speak to her husband before his Alzheimer's progressed. Again, a really emotional story. And this is the kind of book that pulls on your heartstrings and fills you with warmth. There are more books in this series and I still need to read the rest. Beartown by Fredrik Backman. This book is set in a struggling small town in Sweden. There's a lot of pressure on the junior ice hockey team to succeed and win the national tournament, and the town is essentially counting on them, I guess, to win to help its economy. But when the star player of the team commits a horrifying act and essays the GM's daughter, this divides the town. I read this what feels like a lifetime ago now, and my memory is hazy on the details, but I remember the way it made me feel, and Fredrik Backman is just a masterful storyteller. He writes and develops characters so well. There are 2 more books, I think, in this series, which I never actually read, so this year I actually would like to reread this so that I can read the whole of the series. Then I have a YA book, which is You've Reached Sam by Dustin Tao. This is a contemporary fiction with, again, some fantasy/magical realism. You're following the main character Julie, a teenager whose boyfriend passes away from a car accident. Of course, she is shocked and devastated, and when she rings her boyfriend's number just to hear his voice and his voicemail again, he actually answers and his ghost starts talking to her. This is a story about heartbreak, grief, and letting go, because obviously our protagonist can't be spending the rest of her life talking to her dead boyfriend on the phone. I remember seeing a lot of reviews of people saying that they found Julie really annoying, but I'll give her a pass because she's just a teenager and I guess everyone deals with grief in their own way. This was another book that made me cry, and you might be seeing a pattern here with my favourite books. Next book is Golden Girl by Ellen Hildebrand. Last year was the year that I discovered Ellen Hildebrand and I binged so many of her books. She has some winter ones, but the majority of her books are just perfect for the summertime, and they are pretty much all set on the island of Nantucket, where I guess Ellen Hildebrand is from. This is a contemporary fiction with, surprise surprise, more magical realism. This story is centered around a best-selling author who lives on the island of Nantucket, but she passes away after a tragic hit-and-run accident. You follow her in the afterlife as she watches her family, her children, grieve her death and try to move on with their lives. She also gets given these 3 nudges to influence their lives, so she has to use them wisely. There's a mystery element in here as well as they investigate her death, and like a lot of Ellen Hildebrand books, there are family secrets and drama. I really like Ellen Hildebrand stories, and I feel like the majority of them would actually make for really good TV shows. Now on to some cozy feel-good favourites. The Vera Wong series by Jessie Q. Sutanto. There are 2 books so far in the series and I'm really hoping she'll write more. The first book is Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murderers, and the second book is Vera Wong's Guide to Snooping on a Dead Man. These are cozy mysteries, and you're following Vera Wong, who's a 60-year-old Chinese woman who owns a tea house in San Francisco's Chinatown. She basically likes inserting herself in people's business and takes it upon herself to solve murder cases. And these books are so charming, delightful, and funny. I love these books so much, and actually the mystery storylines are really good as well. Another feel-good book I really love is Sylvia's Second Act by Hilary Yablon. This is a contemporary fiction that centres around Sylvia. She's living in a retirement home with her husband when one day she walks into her husband cheating on her, and to top it all off, he has lost all their entire life savings because of bad investments. She is furious, but also sees this as an opportunity to move out of her retirement home and move back into the city to make something of her life again. I feel like this is a really good one for the summer as well, because Sylvia gets back into wedding planning. This was pitched as a kind of older Sex and the City. It has friendships, rivalry, drama, romance. This was also funny. I was actually laughing out loud to myself. The audiobook was really good. I had a good time and this was such a delight. And after reading Sylvia's and Vera Wong's stories, I think I've decided that I quite like an older protagonist. For some reason, there's just something really cozy about an older character. And now for the romance genre, The Sea of Tranquility by Katya Millet. I have always been a reader, but somewhere along the line, I guess, when I entered uni and started working, I didn't really read that much and probably would only read a few books a year, if that. And then I discovered this book randomly in 2019, and this was literally the catalyst for getting me back into reading. This is a young adult / new adult romance. These characters are in high school, but honestly this book has more of a new adult feel. You're following the 2 main characters, Nastia and Josh. They are 2 broken teenagers who have gone through a lot in their lives. Josh's parents have passed away and he's been living with his granddad, who now is also dying. And then you have the new girl in town, Nastia. I don't really know how to pronounce it. She clearly is going through something as well. Something tragic and devastating happened to her to make her act and behave like the way she does. My battery died and now I suddenly feel ill, but where was I? I can't remember what I last said. But this isn't a grumpy sunshine trope, it's grumpy. There are 2 broken teenagers who find each other and fall in love. I love early 2000s teen shows like The OC and One Tree Hill, and this is reminiscent of that in terms of the angst. This book truly started my romance era and definitely defined the kind of romance book that I used to really love back then. I loved anything angsty that was like hate to love or enemies to lovers, where the characters are really grumpy. This book made me laugh, cry, swoon. alone. And because of this book, I would then go on to read so many new adult romances, just trying to chase the feeling that this gave me. Unfortunately, none of them did. And I'm not really in my romance era anymore, but I do read romance here and there as a palate cleanse. But yeah, basically this book is why I got back into reading. And sadly, Millet hasn't written a book since, but I would so love another book from them. The next book is The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger. I read this so long ago. I must have read this like over 10 years ago, and this is a sci-fi romance. I remember when I was younger, I tried to start this so many times, but the time traveling aspect just really confused me, and then I ended up spilling a whole glass of water on it. So the pages are so crispy and crinkled, and then I remember having to borrow my friend's copy to finish off because I really couldn't with this one. You follow this librarian called Henry who has a genetic disorder where he just time travels and he can't control it. He has a wife named Claire, and basically they meet out of order. The older version of Henry time travels back into the past and meets Claire when she's a young girl, and then when an older Claire meets a slightly older Henry, he hasn't actually met her yet in his future and hasn't yet travelled back in time to meet younger Claire. I don't even know if that made sense. It is really confusing. There's also versions of Henry in the past, present and future where he's just travelling all around and meeting different versions of himself. If I think about it too hard, it does hurt my brain, and that's why it took me so many attempts to read this. But eventually, when I got into it, I was so invested in this love story. I will say I didn't love every single aspect of this book. There were some scenes and things where I was like, but I love a tragic love story, and the ending broke me. I remember being like depressed for a week after this, and what can I say, I'm a masochist. And it's actually just really sad that Claire pretty much spends her whole life loving a man who just disappears without a moment's notice, and she doesn't know when he's gonna come back. It's been a while since I watched the film, but I didn't think the film was as good as the book. And then last year I did watch the TV show, which has Theo James and I can't remember the actress's name now, but she plays Ygritte in Game of Thrones. I do think Rachel McAdams was my perfect Claire, but the TV show definitely was better and portrayed the story so much better. But I'm so disappointed that we did not get a season 2 and it's basically unfinished. But at least season 1 ended relatively happy. You know what? I lied. I know I said I would only limit myself to 3 Taylor Jenkins Reid books, but I've just realised that I put another one in the romance category, and that book is One True Loves. You follow Emma, whose husband Jesse disappeared a few years back. He was presumed dead and went missing after an accident, so Emma has had to pick up the pieces after he's gone and rebuild her life again. She is now engaged to her new partner Sam when her husband Jesse returns out of the blue because he's actually been alive this whole time, trying to get back to her, trying to get home. So of course Emma is now facing the dilemma of choosing between her old husband or her new fiance. This is a really bittersweet love story. Back then I didn't really know how I felt about who she chose in the end, but now I look back, I guess I'm okay with the decision she made, and it does make sense. I know Taylor Jenkins Reid doesn't really write pure romances anymore, and her historicals are so wildly successful, but I would so love another romance from her. Next romance is Part of Your World by Abby Jimenez, another really popular book talk book where you have an ER doctor from the big city who has a chance meeting with a small town carpenter. Abby Jimenez is one of my favourite romance authors. I've read her entire backlist now. I have read over 300 romance books, and honestly, I don't have many book boyfriends. I don't easily fall in love with the male characters. Most of the time, I'm just like, they were okay, or meh. But I really liked the male lead in this one. In fact, I tend to like Abby Jimenez's male characters in general. I really liked the dynamic between the 2 main characters and their chemistry. I also like how this book balances out the light-hearted romance with heavier subjects. Again, Abby Jimenez is one of those authors where I'll read anything they write. Then we have The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston. This is a romance that's perfect for the autumn time. It's contemporary with a little fantasy / magical realism element again. Ashley Poston always has some magical realism in her stories, so I always look forward to her new releases. You're following a ghostwriter who, after a bad breakup, is finding it hard to believe in love again. She returns to her hometown after her father's passing, only to start being haunted by the ghost of her editor who unexpectedly died. I like all the themes explored in this story about grief, hope and family, but then at the same time it's still romantic and sweet. This is definitely my favourite Ashley Poston book, and this might be predictable of me, but of course I have Emily Henry on the list as well. I really like Beach Read, but I think my favourite Emily Henry is Funny Story. This is a romantic comedy where the two main female and male main characters are brought together after their respective partners leave them for each other. Again, I always look forward to Emily Henry's new releases. Like Abby Jimenez, she does a mix of women's fiction with romance really well, but Funny Story is definitely one of her lighter ones. I just really liked Daphne as a character, and sometimes I just don't want something too heavy in my romance books because I read a lot of emotional books as it is. On to my favourite thriller books. Kill for Me, Kill for You by Steve Kavanagh. This is such a dark, twisty, fast-paced thriller. Steve Kavanagh is probably my favourite thriller author. Here you have two mothers whose daughters have unfortunately been unalived. They can't get justice, so they want to avenge their daughters, and they decide to swap murders so that they won't get caught. And I think that's really all you need to know about this story. This is the kind of thriller that will have you guessing until the very end. I was on the edge of my seat, and honestly, all the plot twists just blew my mind. I remember finishing this and being like, I have to tell someone about this story. And I remember I rang up my partner and I was literally on the phone to him for 2 hours recounting the entire story for him and being like, oh, guess the plot twist, guess the plot twist. And then he was literally like, I don't know how you told me that in so much detail, but I was just so excited to tell someone this story. I also love The Last Mrs. Parrish by Liv Constantine. I read this years ago, way before my thriller era started. I used to think I couldn't handle thrillers because I get scared really easily. So actually this is a really good thriller for anyone who wants to ease themselves into the genre because it's really not scary and it's quite palatable. You're following this con woman called Amber who's trying to manipulate and infiltrate her way into this wealthy family, the Parrishes. She's trying to steal the husband of this socialite called Daphne, Mrs. Parrish. I just think Liv Constantine built up the storyline and wrote the characters and their backstories so well. They write an unlikable character so well. I hated Amber, and I remember the plot twist just blowing my mind. There's also a sequel to this which I read as well. I think it's called The Next Mrs. Parrish. That was also a fun time and really bingeable. Another thriller that I also read quite a long time ago, They Never Learn by Lane Fargo. I think this is also one of the first thrillers I ever read. You're following a professor at a university who's also a serial unaliver. She chooses the worst men she can find on campus and unalives them, but she's getting kind of sloppy and her latest unaliving almost exposes her. This is a dual timelines thriller and I love a dual timeline. You're also following a freshman student who's out for revenge and planning on an unaliving herself. I would love to reread this one actually now that I'm a much more seasoned thriller reader. I loved the tension in this, the way the story unravelled, and I never see a plot twist coming, but the plot twist was so unexpected and my jaw was on the floor. Such a good thriller. The next book, Idol by Louise O'Neill. This one isn't your typical thriller. I feel like it's a blend of different genres. It's a contemporary fiction with a literary feel and the pacing of a psychological thriller, and it's described as a dark cautionary tale of influencer culture. You follow this influencer who's a wellness guru and she has millions of followers. She's one of those influencers who preaches all this stuff about like speaking your truth. She ends up publishing this essay about a sexual experience with her ex-best friend and she paints it as this really beautiful memory. But then the ex-best friend comes out to say she remembers it very differently and it all goes downhill from there. This was really well written with satirical commentary on influencers. I think this is quite reflective of a lot of influencer drama I've seen play out online. There are always two sides to every story. I think Louise O'Neill did a really good job of writing such an insufferable character, and I also really liked the ending. I never hear anyone talk about this book. For romantasy, I'm going to give a quick shout out to Cassandra Clare. Last year I read the Infernal Devices series. I also read the first 3 books in the Mortal Instruments series. I loved all these books. They are about the Shadowhunter universe, where Shadowhunters hunt demons. The Infernal Devices is set in the Victorian times. I read that first, but then I liked it so much and went on to the Mortal Instruments series, which is set in modern day New York. The storylines are really fun and interesting, and I love the romance. My goal this year is to finish the other 3 books in the Mortal Instrument series. And for the final favourite, it's a non-fiction. There are no memoirs in this video, by the way. I might have to do a separate one for that in the future. This one's a historical non-fiction. It's called The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. This is a book about the untold stories of the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. The 5 victims have commonly been portrayed in the media incorrectly as like women of the night. They were kind of talked about in a way like they had what was coming to them when they were actually just regular women. Hallie Rubenhold does a deep dive into their stories to show that they were just ordinary women who were all going through different struggles that were reflective of the times. They were dealing with things like poverty, homelessness, relationship and family issues. This isn't about how Jack the Ripper unalived these women. It's about how these women were victims of their circumstances growing up in the Victorian era. This shines a light on their mistreatment and the misogyny. Hallie Rubenhold clearly did so much research for this book, and it was so fascinating. I love reading about the Victorian times, and this book is quite morbid and depressing, seeing what all these women had to suffer through. So those were all my favourite books of all time. I probably did miss some, but my brain feels all scrambled and my arm hurts from holding this mic. It's actually really heavy. I think I need to like find a thing to prop it up on so I don't have to hold it. Thank you if you watched this until the end. Let me know if you've read any of these or if any of these are your favourites. Or please let me know if you have any recommendations for emotional books, especially that make you cry, or if you have recommendations for stories with magical realism. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.